The last thing Riven saw before the sky took him was the tail end of his clan disappearing into the dark between stars. They did not look back. He had known, somewhere deep in the back of his mind, that this crossing was going to be hard. The drift corridor was not a kind stretch of space. It was long and cold and thin on the kind of charged stellar winds that a dragon needed to stay aloft between worlds. Grown dragons, healthy dragons, dragons with full wingspans and strong bones. They crossed it in a tight group. They rode each other's wake. They shared the pull of the wind and made it easier for everyone in the formation. Riven had no one sharing the pull with him. He flew at the back, as always, because the back was where the weak ones went, and he was the weak one. His wings were not small. They had grown with the rest of him over the years. But they had never grown right. The scarring along the left wing's inner joint ran deep, old damage from the first days of his life, and it had set wrong. It pulled. It always pulled. Every strong beat of his wings cost him twice what it cost any other dragon his age, and at the back of the formation, he got none of the smooth air that the others carved out ahead of him. He had been falling behind since the 3rd hour of the crossing. By the 5th hour, he could no longer see the dragon ahead of him. By the 7th, his left wing locked mid-beat. It did not hurt exactly. It just stopped working. The joint seized, and the wing folded wrong. And suddenly he was no longer flying. He was falling. In the drift corridor, falling did not mean falling down the way it did on a planet. There was no clear down. There was just the direction he had been going. And then there was every other direction, and his body chose several of them at once as he tumbled. He tried to call out. Dragons did not call out often. It was not something the clan encouraged. But in that moment, spinning in the cold dark with one wing locked and the other beating uselessly, trying to correct a spin it could not correct, he made a sound. A short, sharp sound. The kind of sound a young creature makes when it suddenly understands that it is alone. No one answered. He did not know how long he fell. Time in the drift corridor was strange, and his head was not working well from the cold and the spinning. What he knew was that at some point the spinning slowed, because there was something large nearby, large enough that its gravity was doing something to him. Not a star, not a planet, something man-made. He could see the dark shape of it against the darker dark of space, a flat, wide structure with dead running lights, and the skeletal look of something that had not been used in a long time. An old mining platform, abandoned, drifting. He hit the outer edge of it with his right shoulder and clawed at the surface until he stopped moving. The metal was cold and rough, and he dug his claws in and held on and breathed. Just breathed, in and out. The thin recycled atmosphere bubble clinging to the platform's old life support shell was not much, barely enough, but it was something. His body pulled it in and used it, and he did not die. For a while that was all he did. He held on and did not die. Then he pulled himself up onto the flat top of the platform and lay there and looked up at the corridor of space above him. The clan was long gone. There was no light from them, no sound, no sign that they had ever been there or that he had ever been among them. The crossing would take them to the new territory, the colder mountain range 2 star systems over, and they would settle there and life would continue. One hatchling had not kept pace. It happened. He knew that. He had always known that about his clan. They were not cruel people. They were just honest about survival in a way that left no room for the slow ones. He closed his eyes, and his mind went somewhere else entirely. It went to a smell first. Dry dust and a specific kind of wood that burned low and steady, and underneath that, something warm and alive. Then it went to a sound. A voice, low and unhurried, talking in a language he had not yet understood, the words meaning nothing but the sound of them meaning something anyway. Then it went to a feeling. Something wrapped carefully around his bad wing, not too tight, adjusted 3 times until it sat right. Hands that were smaller than his head and rougher than old bark and completely steady. He had not thought about Aldrich in a long time. He thought about him now. The old man had found him when he was barely out of the egg. He did not know the details of how it had happened, only what he could piece together from memory and instinct. The clan had moved on. He had been left. He had been dying in the rocks on a dry frontier world called Karath 4. And then there had been a human, and then there had not been dying. It was that simple, in the way that the most important things always were. Riven lay on the cold metal of the abandoned platform and looked at the stars and thought about that. He thought about the stone house. He thought about the low table where the old man left food for him, always in the same spot, always at the same time of day. He thought about the way Aldrich had never seemed frightened of him, not once, even when Riven had been confused and in pain and not entirely in control of himself. He thought about the morning the clan had come back for him. Aldrich had stood in the yard and watched them take him. He had not argued. He had not reached out or made any sound. He had just stood there with his arms at his sides and watched, and Riven, young and confused and pulled along by adults far larger than himself, had looked back once. The old man had raised one hand, a small gesture. Then Riven had been swept up into the sky. He had thought about that raised hand more times than he could count. He was thinking about it now, on a dead platform in the cold dark of the drift corridor, with a locked wing and no clan and no plan. He was thinking that there was one place in all the space he had ever moved through that felt like something other than passage. One place that had felt like arrival. He did not know how he was going to get there. He did not have a ship or a communicator or anyone who knew where he was. He had a body that had just survived a fall it probably should not have survived, in a direction that he felt not in his head, but somewhere lower and more certain than thought. He spread his good wings slowly against the metal platform and let the cold of it seep into his scales, and he made a decision. He was going back to Karath 4. He was going back to the old man. His clan had not come back for him this time, and that was fine. He understood them now in a way he had not as a hatchling. He understood that their way of things had no room for what he was looking for. But there was one human on a frontier world who had once slept on cold stone to keep a dying hatchling warm, and Riven had not forgotten that. He was not built to forget that. Whatever else was broken in him, whatever his wings could or could not do, that memory was whole, and it pointed in one direction, and he intended to follow it. He closed his eyes and waited for whatever came next. The stars did not answer him, but they did not need to. He already knew where he was going. Underserved. Underscore. 3 days passed before anything changed. Riven knew this because the platform had one working light somewhere deep in its dead belly, a single emergency indicator that pulsed once every few seconds, red and slow, like a heartbeat that had forgotten it was supposed to stop. He counted the pulses when he could not sleep, which was often. The cold did not bother him the way it would have bothered something softer, but the silence did. The drift corridor was the quietest place he had ever been, and quiet, he was discovering, gave a creature too much space to think. He spent most of those 3 days moving, not flying, walking. The platform was large enough that he could pace its flat surface from one end to the other, and he did this in slow circles, partly to keep his blood moving and partly because lying still made the bad wing ache in a way that moving did not. The joint had unlocked on its own by the end of the first day. It always did eventually. It would seize, scare him, hold for a while, and then release as if nothing had happened. He had lived with this his whole life. He explored the platform when the walking bored him. Most of it was sealed and dead, corridors that had been shut down so long the seals had fused, but he found 2 sections that still had a thin, breathable atmosphere and a little warmth leaking from whatever the platform's old core was still doing in its slow dying. There were no people. There had not been people here in a very long time. He found the remnants of them, a cracked work table, a boot that had been left behind, something that might have once been a meal, now reduced to a flat, dry disk of nothing. He looked at these things and thought about the kind of people who leave a boot behind when they leave a place forever. He found food on the second day. Small things lived in the warm sections of the platform, pale creatures that moved fast and lived in the gaps between wall panels. He was not proud of hunting them, but they were alive and he was hungry, and he ate what he caught and did not waste any of it. On the third day, he stood on the top of the platform and spread both wings. Not to fly. He knew he could not fly, not across the drift, not alone, not with the left wing the way it was. He spread them to look at them. He turned them in the faint starlight and studied the scarring the way he had done many times before, but this time he looked at it differently. He looked at it the way the old man used to look at it, head tilted, patient, moving his eyes from one part to another without rushing. Aldrich had looked at that wing for the first time the day he found Riven. The hatchling had been wedged between 2 large rocks on the dry slope above the settlement, barely conscious, his left wing bent at a wrong angle and already beginning to swell. He had been there for at least a day by the time the old man came up the slope with a pack on his back and a scanner in his hand that was not designed for dragon biology, but was the best available thing. Riven did not remember the finding clearly. He remembered impressions. Heat of fever, the sound of boots on rock, a smell of old soap and worn fabric, and something chemical from the pack. Then hands. Careful hands. The wing was moved very slowly, and he had made a sound, and the hands had stopped immediately, waited, and then continued more slowly still. He had tried to pull away. He had been too weak to do it effectively. The old man had talked the whole time. Not instructions, not warnings, just talking, steady and low, the way someone talks to keep the air from going too quiet. Riven had not understood a word. He had been too young and too sick. But the sound had been consistent, and consistency, he would later understand, was what Aldrich did instead of comfort. He did not say everything is fine, because things were not fine. He just kept talking so the silence would not add itself to everything else that was wrong. He had been carried down the slope wrapped in something from the pack. He had woken up in the stone house. Standing on the platform now, Riven let himself go back into those early weeks in a way he rarely allowed. He was old enough now that the memories were clear, not the blurred impressions of infancy, but real pictures, real sounds. He remembered the low ceiling of the house and the way firelight moved on the stone wall. He remembered the smell of the food Aldrich made for himself, something that came out of a pot and smelled strong, and the different smell of what Aldrich left on the low table for Riven, raw things, fresh things, kept cool in a box near the door. He remembered the first time he understood a word. Aldrich had been working on the wing brace, the third version of it, the one that finally sat right, and he had said a word and looked at the wing and said it again, and Riven had looked at the wing too, and had understood from the context and the tone in the direction of the old man's eyes that the word meant better. He had looked up at the old man. Aldrich had looked back at him. There had been a pause. Then the old man had gone back to work on the brace. That was how it had always been. No ceremony. The thing happened, and then the next thing happened, and Aldrich moved through all of it with the same unhurried attention. He had explained to Riven, much later when Riven could understand more words, that he had been a xenobiological field researcher for 30 years, and that in that time, he had worked on 6 different worlds and encountered things that were not in any manual. He said the first lesson of the work was that you did not stop trying to help something just because you did not know exactly how. He had said it casually, the way he said most things, not looking up from whatever he was doing. Riven had never forgotten it. He folded his wings slowly and stood on the dark platform and thought about how to get off it. He had no communicator. He had no way to signal anyone in any precise way. What he had was a large body, 2 wings that could spread wide even if they could not carry him across star systems, and the fact that this platform was on the edge of a trade corridor that haulers used. Not often, but sometimes. He would have to wait, and when something came close enough to see, he would have to make himself impossible to miss. It was not a good plan. It was the only plan. He went back to the warm section of the platform and lay down and let the thin heat of the dying core settle against his scales, and he went back to his memories of the stone house, because they were the warmest thing available to him, and he intended to use every resource he had. He remembered the cold snap that had come in the 2nd month. The temperature on Karath had dropped sharply, and the fire in the house had not been enough, and he had been feverish again, the wing infection flaring, and Aldrich had done something that Riven had not understood at the time. The old man had brought his sleeping roll into the part of the house where Riven rested. He had set it down on the floor close enough that the heat would carry, and he had gone to sleep there, on the stone floor, with nothing but a thin roll between him and it. He had done this for 9 nights. On the 9th night, Riven, feeling steadier, had shifted in his sleep and ended up curled close against the sleeping old man without meaning to. He had woken and found this and started to move away. Aldrich had not woken. Riven had stayed still, not wanting to disturb him. He had stayed still for a long time. He thought about that now, on the cold platform, in the silence of the drift, and he felt something in his chest that he did not have a word for in any language. Something that was not sadness exactly, and not missing exactly, and not longing exactly, but contained parts of all 3, and something else underneath them that was quieter and more certain. He had not chosen the old man. He had not been old enough to choose anything when it started. But something about being cared for by a creature that had no reason to care for you, something about that specific thing, had made a mark on him that years and distance had not touched. His clan had not come back this time. The last one had not looked back. But there was a stone house on a dry frontier world, and in that house there was an old man who had slept on a cold floor for 9 nights, so a sick hatchling would not be alone in the dark, and Riven was going to get back there if it took every good scale on his body to do it. On the 4th day, a cargo hauler appeared at the edge of his vision. He climbed to the top of the platform. He spread his wings as wide as they would go, broken joint and all. He held that position until the holding of it hurt, and then he held it longer. The hauler changed course. It was coming toward him. Riven lowered his wings and breathed and waited. And for the first time since he had fallen out of the crossing, he felt something other than cold. He felt like he was already on his way. The crew of the hauler was 4 people, and none of them knew what to do with him. This was clear from the moment they opened the cargo bay door and found Riven standing on the platform, wings folded, waiting. The first one out had made a sound and stepped back into the second one, and there had been a short period of everyone talking at once while Riven stood still and waited for it to settle. He had learned, in his time among humans, that they needed a moment when something surprised them. They made noise, they moved, and then they became themselves again. You just had to let it happen. He spoke first once the noise died down. His human common tongue was not perfect. He had learned it young, on Karath 4, mostly from an old man who talked to himself more than he talked to Riven, and then sharpened it over the years at the clan's edge of explored space, where human traders sometimes passed through. He was functional. He was not graceful. He told them he needed passage to Station Ordell. The hauler captain, a wide-shouldered woman with gray threading through her hair and the permanent squint of someone who had spent too many years looking at bright instrument panels and dark cockpits, stared at him for a long moment. Then she said that Ordell was not their destination. Then she looked at him standing alone on a dead platform in the middle of the drift corridor with a damaged wing and no visible means of going anywhere. Then she said they would take him to Ordell. He rode in the cargo section because there was nowhere else on the ship large enough for him. The crew left him alone, which he was grateful for. He slept for most of the 2-day transit. Real sleep, not the half-alert resting he had managed on the platform. His body was making up for lost time, knitting itself back together from the fall and the cold and the days of too little food, and he let it. He woke occasionally when the ship changed course or when someone came to leave food near the cargo bay door, always placed quietly, and then the person would leave. He appreciated that too. Station Ordell announced itself through the cargo bay's small viewport as a cluster of lights against the black, growing slowly into the shape of a thing built by many people over many years with no particular plan, just need added onto need, until something large and ungainly and entirely functional existed where nothing had been before. It was not beautiful. It was busy and loud and smelled, even through the hull, of fuel and recycled air and the particular sharpness of too many different species sharing the same filtered atmosphere. The hauler captain gave him a piece of paper before she let him off. It was not really paper. It was a transit chit, a thin flat thing with the ship's registry on it, and she told him to carry it because it would show he had arrived on a registered vessel and had not simply appeared on the station illegally. He took it carefully in 2 claws and thanked her. She nodded. Then she said, without looking at him, that she hoped he found what he was looking for. He did not know how she knew he was looking for something. He supposed it was obvious. Ordell's docking section let him through with less trouble than he expected, mostly because the chit worked and partly because Ordell was the kind of station that had seen enough strange things that one young dragon traveling alone barely qualified as interesting. The dock officer stamped something, handed him a visitor marker to clip somewhere, and waved him through without ceremony. The main corridor of Ordell was not built for something his size, but it was built for enough different sizes that he could move through it if he was careful. He kept his wings tight to his body and his tail close and moved slowly near the wall, and most people got out of the way without being asked. A few stared. A few children pointed. He paid attention to none of it and kept moving. The problem arrived at the transit registration desk in the form of a clerk named, according to his badge, Willett, who had small neat features and the energy of a person who found the rules genuinely interesting. Willett explained to Riven that crossing from Ordell into human colonial space required a transit registration. The transit registration required either a clan travel document issued by the Dragon Territorial Authority or an escort letter from a registered compact member organization, or a species welfare clearance filed at least 72 hours in advance. Riven had none of these things. Without them, Willett said, he could not process the transit. He was sorry. He did not look particularly sorry. Riven explained, as clearly as he could in common tongue, that he needed to reach the planet Karath 4 because there was an old man there who had once helped him and he intended to go back to him. Willett blinked. He said that was not a category he had a form for. Riven said he understood. He asked what form came closest. They went back and forth like this for a while. Riven was patient. He had learned patience early, from watching an old man who never raised his voice and never hurried, and still always got to where he was going. He sat on the floor in front of Willett's desk, which put them closer to eye level, and he worked through the problem one piece at a time without frustration. Willett, to his credit, worked with him. The man clearly believed in the rules, but he also believed in thoroughness, and thoroughness meant actually examining every option before closing a case. It was during this exchange that Sarah appeared. She was sitting at the long waiting bench against the far wall, one boot up on the seat beside her, a small metal cup in her hand that she had clearly been nursing for a while. She was mid-height, dark-haired, with the look of someone who had spent a lot of time in cockpits and not much time anywhere with comfortable chairs. Her freight pilot's license tag was clipped to her jacket in the manner of someone who kept it there out of habit rather than pride. She had been there when Riven arrived. She was still there now. She was watching. He noticed her the way he noticed most things, peripherally, cataloged, and set aside while he dealt with the immediate problem. But at some point during the conversation with Willett, she set her cup down and leaned forward with her elbows on her knees and listened more openly. When Riven had exhausted the last category and Willett had regretfully confirmed that none of the available forms covered his situation and that he would need to contact the clan territorial authority to obtain the proper documentation, which would take a minimum of 2 weeks, she spoke. She did not speak to Willett. She spoke to Riven. She asked him one question. She said, "Does the old man know you are coming?" Riven said no. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the transit desk. She looked at him. Then she said, "Of course he doesn't," in the tone of someone who has just heard the most unreasonable and therefore most honest thing said all day. She stood up, picked up her cup, and walked to the desk. She put the cup down on the counter. She laid her freight pilot's license next to it. She told Willett that she was registering a live xenobiological transfer for a research facility on Karath 4 and that the subject was already documented under her vessel's cargo manifest, and she would need the transit stamp processed by the end of the hour because her departure window was fixed. Willett looked at Riven. He looked at Sarah. He looked at the license. He picked up his stamp. Outside the transit office, in the corridor, Riven looked at her and said nothing for a moment. Then he asked why. She picked up her cup and started walking back toward the docking section. She said she had a freight run going roughly that direction anyway, and it was no great trouble. She said it in the way people say things when they do not want to explain the real reason, quickly and without looking at the person they're saying it to. He followed her. He did not push the question. He had learned that from the old man too. Some things people told you when they were ready and not before, and pushing only made them take longer. Her ship was called the Arlo Grey. It was a mid-size freight hauler, older, well kept in the way that working vessels were kept by people who depended on them rather than by people who loved them. She walked him through the cargo section, which was largely empty on this run, and told him this was where he would be riding. She said it without apology. He said it was fine, and meant it. She was almost back to the cockpit when she stopped. She did not turn around. She said, her back still to him, that she had been on a long run when her father died. She said she had gotten the message 2 days after, and by the time she turned back it was too late for anything except the afterward. She said she did not know why she was telling him that. She went back to the cockpit without waiting for him to respond. Riven settled into the cargo section. The Arlo Grey pulled away from Station Ordell with a low shudder of its engines finding their rhythm, and the lights of the station slid past the Hold's small viewport and then fell away into the dark. He thought about what she had said. He thought about what it must be like to be a creature that moved fast through space and still arrived too late. He thought about the old man on Karath 4, moving slowly through his days, and he felt something press against the inside of his chest that was not quite urgency and not quite fear, but was related to both. He had survived the fall. He had gotten off the platform. He had gotten off Ordell. He was not there yet. But he was closer, and he was not traveling alone anymore. The Arlo Grey had been traveling for a day and a half when the patrol ship found them. It did not come out of nowhere. Sarah had been watching the border checkpoint indicators on her navigation panel for the last several hours, and she had said nothing about it to Riven, but the quiet way she said nothing told him that she was thinking carefully about something. He had stayed in the cargo hold and let her think. He was good at waiting. He had had a lot of practice. The patrol ship matched their speed and opened a channel, and the voice that came through Sarah's cockpit speaker was calm and deliberate, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had conducted a large number of inspections and found that a calm voice at the start saved everyone time. The voice identified itself as Commander Draven of the Galactic Compact Border Authority, operating on the edge of human colonial space, and it requested that the Arlo Grey hold position for a routine transit check. Sarah held position. Two things happened in the inspection that followed. The first was expected. Draven's crew scanned the Arlo Grey, reviewed Sarah's transit paperwork and her cargo manifest, and found the registration for a live xenobiological transfer. They requested visual confirmation of the cargo. Sarah opened the cargo hold camera. Riven sat in the hold, folded and still, and looked at the camera, and the visual confirmation was confirmed. The second thing was not expected, at least not by Riven. Draven, running the species identification from the scan, pulled Riven's biological markers and cross-referenced them with the Compact's registry. The registry found his clan. The registry showed, quite clearly, that Riven belonged to a clan currently registered in the Dragon Reach territory, that he had no individual travel documents, and that he had no escort from his clan authority. Draven's voice came through the speaker again, still calm. He said he was going to need to contact Riven's clan for identity verification before he could authorize the transit into human colonial space. He said this was standard procedure for unescorted minor classification species members transiting through a protected corridor. Riven said nothing. He sat in the hold and listened. Draven contacted Dragon Reach. The response took 40 minutes. Riven lay on his side in the cargo hold and looked at the ceiling of it and counted rivets and did not think about what the response might be, because thinking about it would not change it, and he had learned not to spend energy on things he could not change. Aldrich had taught him that too, not in words but in practice, by being someone who simply moved to the next thing that could be done rather than staying with the thing that could not. The response came through and Draven read it, and there was a pause before he spoke again. He said that the clan authority had confirmed Riven's identity. He said the clan authority had also stated, formally and for the record, that Riven had fallen behind during a sanctioned relocation crossing, that the clan had no obligation under territorial charter to retrieve members who could not maintain crossing pace, and that the clan was declining to claim jurisdiction over his current situation. He read all of this in the same calm voice he had used for everything else. But there was something different in the pauses between the sentences. Small pauses. The kind a person makes when they are reading words they find unpleasant. Sarah said something from the cockpit that was short and not polite. Riven said nothing. He had known, in some part of himself that had known things long before his mind caught up, that this was what the clan would say. It was not a surprise. It landed anyway. There was a difference between knowing a thing and having it confirmed in a compact border log by a stranger's voice reading it aloud into official record. He breathed through it, in and out. He let it settle where it needed to settle. Then he heard Draven's voice again, and this time the calm in it had a different texture. A little more careful, a little less automatic. Draven said that he now had a situation outside his standard processing parameters. He had a dragon hatchling, unescorted, refused by his own clan, traveling on a freight manifest toward a human colony planet for reasons that were not commercial, military, or politically categorized. He said he was going to need to hold them at the checkpoint until he could determine the correct protocol. Then Sarah asked if she could speak to him directly, not over the speaker. She asked if she could dock with the patrol ship and speak to him in person. There was a pause from Draven's side. Then he said yes. Riven did not go. He stayed in the cargo hold while Sarah took the docking arm across to the patrol ship. He sat and he waited, and the patrol ship was very quiet outside, and the checkpoint lights blinked slowly at the edge of the Arlo Grey's viewport, red and yellow, the colors of hold position. He did not know exactly what she said to Draven. He knew it took a long time. Over an hour. He could hear nothing from the docked ship, and Sarah had turned off the channel before she left. What he pieced together later, from the small things she mentioned and the things she chose not to mention, was this. She had sat down across from Draven in whatever room the patrol ship used for such conversations. She had not brought paperwork or arguments or legal references. She had told him the story, not a version of the story shaped to be useful, just the story. A hatchling left behind on a frontier world. An old man who found it dying in the rocks. Weeks of care with no training and no reason except that the thing needed help. The clan coming back to collect a hatchling that was now healthy enough to be worth collecting. The old man watching it go and raising one hand. A young dragon falling out of a crossing in deep space, landing on a dead platform, surviving through stubbornness, finding passage, navigating a transit desk with broken common tongue, and now sitting in a cargo hold at a checkpoint while a border authority decided whether his reason for going somewhere counted as a reason. Draven had listened to all of it. Sarah said that when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Just quiet. She said he had the expression of a person who had just been handed something his job had not prepared him for, and was deciding what a person, rather than an officer, did with it. Then he had asked one question. He asked how old the human was. Sarah had said she did not know exactly. Old. He lived alone on a frontier colony world and had been a field researcher for decades. Draven had nodded slowly. He had picked up his stamp. When Sarah came back through the docking arm, she had the clearance documents in her hand. Full transit authorization into human colonial space. Under purpose of travel, it read, humanitarian transit, extenuating circumstances. Under the notes field, which Draven was not required to fill in and most officers left blank, he had written one line. It read, subject has adequate cause. That was all. The docking arm disengaged, and the Arlo Grey pulled away from the checkpoint. The patrol ship did not follow. As the distance opened between them, the communication channel crackled once, and Draven's voice came through a final time. He said, tell the old man his paperwork is in order. Then the channel closed. Sarah set the ship back on course and said nothing for a while. Riven could hear her from the cargo hold, the sounds of the cockpit settling back into its standard running, small adjustments, a calibration, the low hum of the drive working at full capacity again. He looked down at his claws. He looked at the damaged wing, the old scars catching what little light was in the hold. He thought about the word that Draven had written. Adequate. A small word. A careful word. The kind of word a man used when he meant something larger but did not know if he was allowed to write it into an official record. Adequate cause. He thought about the old man, sitting in the stone house on a dry frontier world, not knowing any of this was happening. Not knowing that a border officer in deep space had just decided, quietly, and for his own reasons, to let a dragon through because someone told him a story. Not knowing that a freight pilot was cutting her route short. Not knowing that his hatchling was on the other side of the checkpoint now, closer than he had been in years, moving through the dark with a name that was not on any clan list, but was on a compact transit authorization under extenuating circumstances. Aldrich would not know any of it. He would just hear the sound of something landing outside his door. And Riven, for the first time since he had fallen from the crossing, let himself feel how close that was. Not close in terms of distance. Still days of travel. But close in the way that things are close when nothing that matters is standing between you anymore. The way was open. He was going home. Karathfor came into view through the hold viewport as a pale brown shape against the black, the color of dry earth and old stone, ringed faintly with the thin atmosphere that sat over it like something that had not quite decided to stay. It was not a beautiful planet. It never had been. It was the kind of world that people came to when they wanted to be far from other people, and the land showed it, wide and open and indifferent. Riven pressed his nose against the viewport glass and looked at it, and did not move for a long time. Sarah brought the Arlo Grey down in a slow, steady descent toward the colony docking port on the eastern edge of the main settlement. She was a good pilot. She did not rush the landing, and she did not make it rough. And when the ship leveled out on approach, the settlement spread below them in the way small frontier places always look from the air, a handful of structures that had organized themselves around water and shade and not much else, the stone-colored rooftops of people who had built to last rather than to look like anything. Riven knew the shape of it from above. He had left it from above, years ago, carried up into the sky by his clan in a group that had not asked his opinion about going. He knew which direction the old man's homestead was from the port. He had known it since the moment the planet appeared in the viewport. Something in him had oriented the way a needle orients, not thought out, just done. The cargo ramp was still lowering when he stepped off it. He did not mean to be impatient. The ramp moved at its own speed, and he moved at his, and those two speeds were not the same. His front claws touched the ramp while it was still a meter from the ground, and then he was walking down it as it continued to move, and then he was on the ground of Karath 4, and the ramp finished its descent behind him without him on it. The smell of the place hit him first. Not the port smell. Fuel and metal and the exhaust of arriving and departing ships. He did not care about that. Underneath it, because this was a world with wide, open spaces and the wind came off the land and across the port from the direction of the settlement. Underneath the port smell was the smell of Karath 4 itself. Dry soil. Thornwood brush. The particular mineral sharpness of the rock that made up most of this region. Dust that had been baked by a sun that ran a little cooler than the standard and therefore baked more patiently. He had not smelled that smell in years, and his body reacted to it before his mind had finished recognizing it. His wings, both of them, lifted slightly at the joint, a reflex, the way wings moved on a dragon when something important happened. He brought them back down immediately, but the reflex had happened, and he noted it. He looked back once at the Arlo Gray. Sarah was at the top of the ramp, arms crossed, watching him. She made a small motion with her chin. Forward. Go. He turned back toward the settlement and went. He moved through the port quickly, not running but close to it, and the few people in the port at that hour got out of the way efficiently, which he appreciated. Once past the port's outer fence, the land opened up and he could move the way he wanted to move, which was faster. The path to the old man's homestead was not a path, exactly. It was a direction. He knew the direction the way he knew his own heartbeat. His feet found the ground in a rhythm that was not flight, but was the next best thing to it, a long strided ground movement that covered distance without wasting it. And the dry soil was familiar under his claws, and the wind from the west was familiar on his face, and the son of Karath 4 sat at a familiar angle that threw familiar shadows, and all of it, every detail, was speaking to him in a language that had nothing to do with words. He went past the edge of the settlement without going through it. He knew the way that went around. The thornwood brush on the slope above the houses was familiar, and he moved through it, and the smell of it was exactly what it had always been, and he did not slow down. Then he came over the top of a low rise, and the stone house was there. He stopped. He had not planned to stop. He had been moving steadily for an hour, and stopping was not something he had considered. But he came over the rise and saw the house, and his legs simply paused, and he stood on the rise and looked at it. It was smaller than he remembered. He understood, in the part of his mind that processed things calmly, that he was larger, and that the house had not changed. But the first feeling was that the house was smaller, the way things from very early in a life are always smaller when you return to them, because you grew around the memory of them, and the memory is always the full size of the feeling, not the actual size of the thing. The stone walls were the same color. The fire pit in the yard, the rough stone circle with the old iron grate over it, was the same. There was a pile of wood stacked against the east wall, covered with a piece of treated canvas to keep the dust off. The wood pile was large. Someone had stacked enough for a long time. The door was closed. The fire pit was cold. No smoke. The sun was at mid-afternoon, and the house sat quiet in it. Riven stood on the rise for longer than he had expected to. He had not thought that arriving would be harder than traveling. He had assumed that getting here would be the hard part, and being here would be the easy part. He was discovering this was not how it worked. He had crossed deep space on bad wings, and survived a dead platform, and navigated bureaucracy in broken common tongue, and gotten through a border checkpoint on the strength of a story told by someone else. None of that had frightened him the way the closed door of the stone house was frightening him now. He knew what he was afraid of. He was afraid of what might not be there. The old man was old. He had been old when Riven left, and years had passed, and the old got older, and sometimes things happened. Riven had made this entire journey on the certainty of something he had no way to verify, and standing on the rise looking at a closed door in the afternoon quiet. The certainty was still there, but the fear was also there, sitting right next to it. He went down the slope. He crossed the yard. He stepped past the fire pit. He stood in front of the door. He waited. There was a sound from inside. Small sounds. The kind a person made when they moved through a familiar space without thinking about it. A shuffling step. Something set down on a surface. The low sound of someone breathing through a task, unconscious and slow. Someone was home. Riven let out a breath he had been holding, apparently, for some time. The door opened. Aldrich stepped out. He was smaller. That was the first thing Riven registered, the same way the house was smaller. But with the old man it was different because the old man actually was smaller, not in Riven's perception, but in fact. He had lost height, the way old humans did, the body settling into itself. His hair was fully white now, where it had been gray with threads of it before. His face had more lines. His hands, when they came up to shade his eyes against the afternoon sun so he could see what was in his yard, were thinner, the bones closer to the surface. He looked at Riven. He took in the wings first, because they were the largest part. Then he moved his eyes across the rest of Riven with the same patient attention he had used on everything, the scarring, the road-worn scales. The way Riven was standing with his weight shifted slightly right, compensating for the left wings pull the same way he always had. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You look terrible." He turned around and went back inside. He left the door open. Riven stood in the yard for exactly 1 second. Then he went in. The inside of the house was the same and not the same. The ceiling was the same low stone. The fire pit inside, the small indoor one, was the same iron grate, cold now but with ash in it that said it had been used recently. The smell of old smoke and dust, and the specific lived-in smell of a person who had occupied a space long enough that they and the space had come to an agreement about each other. The low table was in the same spot. Aldrich was at the other side of the room, doing something at the shelf that held his supplies. He was not looking at Riven. He was moving slowly and deliberately, getting something down, checking it, setting it aside. He filled the kettle and put it on the small burner. Then he went to the cold box near the door, the same cold box, and he took out a piece of smoked meat, and he set it on the low table, on the same side of the table where a hatchling used to eat. He did not say anything. He went to his chair and sat down and picked up the thing he had been reading before he got up to check the door, some old text on a worn reader, and he settled his glasses on his face and read. Riven looked at the piece of meat on the table. He looked at the old man in the chair. He crossed the room, slowly, and lay down beside the low table the way he used to, curled on his side with his nose a few inches from the table's edge, the way that fit the space and fit the memory simultaneously. He ate the meat. It was the same recipe. He did not know how he knew that. He just knew. The kettle heated up. Aldrich got up and made his tea and came back to the chair. Outside, the afternoon moved across Karath for the way afternoons did on this world, unhurried, the light shifting through the warm end of the spectrum and the shadows from the thornwood stretching long across the dry ground. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The first morning back, Riven woke before the old man did. This surprised him, because in all his memories of the stone house, Aldrich was always already awake when he opened his eyes. The old man had been one of those people who seemed to begin the day without announcement, already present and doing something quiet by the time anyone else thought about waking. But this morning, in the early gray before the sun came over the eastern ridge, the house was still, and Aldrich's breathing from the back room was slow and even, and Riven lay in the main room alone with the cold ash in the fire pit and the pale light at the door's edge, and the sound of Karath for waking up outside. The birds of this region were not common birds. They were small and had calls that were more click than song, and they started before dawn, and Riven lay there and listened to them, and felt the specific quality of stillness that belongs to a familiar place before the day begins. Not the emptiness of the platform in the drift. Not the constant moving noise of Station Ordell or the patrol ship's hum. This particular quiet. It had weight and shape, and it fit around him. He did not go back to sleep. He lay still until he heard the old man stir, and then he heard the slow process of Aldrich getting up, which took longer than it used to, more sounds, more adjustments, and then footsteps, and then the old man appeared in the doorway between the rooms and looked at him. Aldrich said good morning in the same voice he used for everything, flat and unhurried. The way a person says something they have been saying long enough that the words have worn smooth. Riven said good morning back. They had breakfast, which was the meat Aldrich cooked for himself and the raw things from the cold box that he set on the low table, and they ate in the same mutual silence they had fallen into the night before, not uncomfortable, not empty, just the silence of two creatures who had already understood each other and did not need to keep proving it with noise. After breakfast, Aldrich picked up his kit. The kit was old. Riven recognized it as the same field pack the old man had used in the early days, the one that had been on his back the day he came up the slope above the settlement. It had more patches on it now, places that had worn through and been fixed, repaired with different colored material, so the patches were obvious, a record of use written in mismatched fabric. Aldrich opened it on the table and began to sort through it. Riven watched him and said nothing. The old man took out his scanner, the same basic handheld unit, updated at some point because the body of it was newer than Riven remembered, but the way Aldrich held it was the same, comfortably, the grip of a person who had been holding a tool long enough that the hand and the tool had made accommodations for each other. He ran it slowly over Riven's left wing from a short distance, reading the data as it came up, his face doing the same thing it had always done when he was thinking about something specific, a small settling around the eyes, attention focused down to a point. He said, "The joint's worse than it was." Riven said yes. The old man said, "It's set wrong again after the fall?" Riven said he thought so. Aldrich nodded slowly. He set the scanner down and brought out some of the other things from the kit, materials for work, and he said that they would see what could be done. He said it the same way he had always said such things, without promise and without pessimism, just the plain statement of someone who intended to try and had not yet decided what the trying would produce. This was how the days began. Aldrich spent an hour or two each morning working on the wing, carefully, slowly, the same methodical patience he had applied to it years ago, now with better information because he had more years of observation behind him, and because Riven was old enough to tell him where it hurt, and how it moved, and what positions caused the seizing, and what helped it release. He had sourced materials from his old research contacts. Things that Riven gathered had taken some time, and some letters to acquire, though the old man did not say so directly. He had simply had them when he needed them. In the afternoons they were mostly separate. Aldrich had his work, the ongoing cataloging of local specimens that had been his self-assigned project since his research posting ended, and he did this at his desk with the same concentration he brought to everything. Riven went outside. He walked the slopes, relearning the land, following the paths he had made as a hatchling, and finding that his body still knew them even when the physical trails had been covered over by years of growth. He caught his own food in the afternoons, which Aldrich did not comment on, and he sat on the high rock above the house when the sun was at its warmest and looked out over the dry, wide country and felt the wind off the ridge on his scales. On the fourth day, he went around the side of the house to the barn. The barn was where Aldrich kept the tools and the field equipment and the covered transport vehicle that he used to reach the far parts of his study area. Riven had not been in the barn as a hatchling. It had been a smaller structure, and he had been barely allowed near it because young dragons and stored equipment were a combination Aldrich had been sensibly cautious about. The barn was larger now, not in the way that barns gradually accumulated additions over years of necessity. Larger in a specific way, a deliberate way, the east wall pushed out and rebuilt, the main door widened, the ceiling inside raised. The work was not recent. The stone of the new wall had the same weathering as the old stone, years of sun and wind settling the surface to the same texture. This had been done a long time ago. Riven stood in front of the open barn door and looked at the ceiling clearance inside. He looked at the width of the door. He looked at the weathered stone of the new wall. He thought about numbers. He thought about how many years had passed since a hatchling had been taken away from this homestead by his clan. He thought about how large that hatchling would have grown by now. He thought about whether the dimensions of this barn matched those calculations. They did. He went back inside without saying anything. Aldrich was at his desk, working, his back to the door. He did not turn around when Riven came in. He said, without looking up, that the east wall had been done several years back when the transport vehicle got too large and needed more clearance. He said it in the same flat voice he used for everything. Riven looked at the back of the old man's head. The white hair, the slight curve of the shoulders that had not been there years ago, the body carrying its age in the way old bodies did, honestly, without hiding it. He said nothing. He went and lay down beside the low table and looked at the stone ceiling and breathed. 3 weeks in, a message came through Aldrich's comm unit from Station Ordell. Sarah, checking that the delivery had reached its destination. She wrote in the clipped, practical way she spoke, short lines, no extra words. She asked if everything was in order. She said she was on another run, heading in the opposite direction, but she had wanted to know. Aldrich read the message over Riven's rough description of who she was. Then he sat down and wrote back. He thanked her plainly. He said the cargo was in good condition. He said that if she passed through the Karath system on future runs, there was a decent landing pad at the settlement dock, and they kept fare rates. He sent it and went back to his work. Riven thought that was exactly the right thing to say. Around the same time, though neither of them knew it, a patrol ship somewhere on the border of human space was completing its monthly log. Commander Draven filed his reports in the same thorough way he did everything. Near the end of the log, under a section for officers' notes and observations, he wrote a single entry that was not required and was not prompted by any incident. He wrote it because something had been sitting with him since the morning he had stamped a transit clearance for a freight hauler carrying a hatchling with no clan and no papers, and he had not yet found the right place to put it. He wrote, "Recommend review of species welfare transit protocol for cases where clan authority has declined jurisdiction. Current framework does not adequately account for situations where the transiting individual's primary bond is with a member of another species. Suggest addendum covering defined extenuating circumstances. Personal note, the decision I made was correct. I have no doubt about that." He filed it and moved on. Neither Riven nor Aldrich ever knew about this entry. It did not matter to the shape of their days. The days had their own shape, and it did not require anything from the wider galaxy to hold it. The evenings were the best part. The sun went down long and slow on Karath 4, the sky going through colors that were different from most worlds because the atmosphere scattered light a little differently here, more red than orange, a deep quality to the dusk that was particular to this place. Aldrich would make his tea and bring it outside and sit by the fire pit when the weather allowed, and Riven would come out and lie on the flat stone near it, close enough for warmth, and the fire would burn low and steady, and the clicks of the night birds would start in the thornwood. They talked sometimes, not about big things, about what Aldrich had observed that day in his study area, a new nesting behavior in the cliff birds, a change in the plant growth near the eastern water source, about what Riven had seen on the slopes. Practical things, small things, the things that made up days. Sometimes they did not talk at all. On one of those quiet evenings, late in the first month, Riven lay beside the fire pit and looked up at the sky above Karath 4. The drift corridor was visible on clear nights as a faint pale band across the dark, the compressed starlight of a long transit route seen from the outside. He could see it from here. He looked at it for a while. He thought about the fall, the spinning and the cold, and the sound he had made when he understood he was alone. He thought about the platform and the small pale creatures and the red pulse of the emergency light, counting its slow seconds. He thought about Sarah and Willett and Draven's voice reading words from a clan authority that had declined to claim him. He looked away from the corridor and looked at the fire. His wings had failed. The clan had gone on without him. The galaxy had processed him as a logistical problem and eventually, through the small choices of a few ordinary people, had let him through. None of that was what he was thinking about, looking at the fire. He was thinking about a barn wall built to the wrong proportions for any equipment that needed to be stored there. Built years ago, weathered to match the old stone. Built quietly, without announcement, by an old man who had let a hatchling go because it was the right thing to do and had spent the years since then making room for the possibility that the hatchling might come back. Not certainty, not a plan, just room, just a door made wide enough. That was the thing about humans that the galaxy had never quite been able to measure or categorize or file a form for. They did things for reasons that made no practical sense, for creatures that might never return, in the direction of possibilities that had no guarantee attached to them. They made room for things that had not happened yet. They showed up on cold slopes with packs not designed for the problem in front of them, and they stayed. The old man was reading by the fire now, the worn reader in his hand, his glasses slightly low on his nose the way they always settled after a while. He turned a page. He reached for his tea without looking, found it where he had left it, drank from it, set it back. Riven watched him. The fire burned between them, low and steady, and the drift corridor was a pale smear above the horizon, very far away, and the night birds clicked in the thornwood, and Karath 4 turned in its slow, patient way under a sky full of indifferent stars. His wings had failed him. The clan had not come back. The galaxy had stamped his paperwork and waved him through. But there had always been one direction the compass pointed. One place that had never been anywhere except where it was. He was in it. He closed his eyes. He was home.